She was the last woman left on stage, completely rejected by every man. Then the most dangerous of them all stepped out of the shadows to claim her. The humiliation burned through Evelyn's chest like liquid fire as she stood alone on the auction platform, the last woman without a match. 26 years old and supposedly in her prime, she had walked onto that stage with trembling hands and desperate hope, believing that surely one of the region's most desired men would claim her as his companion. Instead, the suffocating silence stretched through the great hall like a living thing, wrapping around her throat and squeezing until she could barely breathe. The whispers started low, a serpentine hiss that slithered through the crowd as hundreds of eyes burned into her skin. "Not even Marcus bid for her," someone murmured from the shadows. Poor thing, standing there like a wilted flower. 26 and still unclaimed. There must be something terribly wrong with her. Each word struck her like a physical blow. Evelyn's fingers clenched the silk fabric of her ceremonial dress, the pale blue material that had taken her 3 months to afford, now feeling like a mockery against her trembling skin. Around her, the empty chairs where other women had sat moments before seemed to mock her solitude. One by one, she had watched them descend from the platform with radiant smiles, claimed by strong hands and promising futures, until only she remained like a forgotten relic on display. The great hall of the mountain community had never felt so vast, its stone walls echoing with the cruel symphony of her rejection. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to laugh at her misfortune. The scent of pine and wood smoke that usually comforted her now felt suffocating, a reminder of everything she would never belong to. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the judgment that pressed down on her from every direction. Elder Miriam, the spiritual leader who had overseen the auction with cold efficiency, cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should conclude tonight's ceremony," she announced, her voice carrying the false sympathy that made Evelyn's stomach turn. "Some matches are simply not meant to be." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Evelyn felt tears threatening to spill over her carefully applied makeup, the rouge and powder that had taken her an hour to perfect, now feeling like war paint for a battle she had already lost. She had always known she was different. Her stubborn streak ran deeper than mountain roots, and her compassion for all living things often put her at odds with the community's harsher traditions. Where other women learned to bend like willows in the wind, Evelyn had grown straight and tall, like an oak, refusing to compromise her beliefs even when it meant standing alone. Her insatiable curiosity had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. While other girls her age had focused on domestic skills and pleasing potential suitors, Evelyn had spent her evenings reading forbidden books and asking questions that made the elders uncomfortable. She challenged the status quo with the persistence of water wearing away stone, never content to simply accept, because that's how things have always been, as an answer. Now, as she stood exposed and vulnerable before the entire community, those differences felt like scarlet letters branded into her skin. The mountain region's ancient traditions demanded conformity, and she had failed spectacularly to meet their expectations. Monthly ceremonies under the full moon had always felt magical to her, with ancient songs echoing off the rocky slopes and the intoxicating aroma of burning medicinal herbs filling the night air. The elders' hypnotic dances around crackling bonfires had sparked her imagination and filled her dreams with possibilities beyond the narrow confines of her prescribed life. But tradition was a double-edged sword. The same customs that created beauty and meaning also enforced rigid rules about marriage, status, and a woman's place in their society. Every important decision, from matrimonial choices to resolving community conflicts, was filtered through centuries-old practices that left little room for individual desires or unconventional paths. Evelyn's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she prepared to step down from the platform in disgrace. Her family would be mortified. Her mother had spent weeks preparing for this night, choosing the perfect dress, arranging her hair just so, coaching her on how to stand and smile to attract the right kind of attention. All of that effort wasted, all of those dreams crumbling like autumn leaves in her trembling hands. The crowd began to shift restlessly, ready to move on to the celebration feast that traditionally followed successful matchings. Evelyn could already imagine the pitying looks, the whispered conversations that would follow her for months, possibly years. She would become the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters. See what happens when you're too proud, too different, too unwilling to compromise. But then, something changed. A ripple of electricity seemed to surge through the air, starting from the back of the great hall and rolling forward like a wave. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the torch flames seemed to flicker and bend, as if responding to some unseen force. Evelyn felt the fine hairs on her arms stand on end, and a shiver that had nothing to do with the mountain's evening chill raced down her spine. From the deepest shadows at the rear of the hall, a figure emerged. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. The crowd parted before him without conscious thought, bodies instinctively creating a path as if recognizing something primal and dangerous in his presence. Evelyn had heard whispers about him for years, hushed stories told in the safety of daylight about the mysterious man who lived on the highest peak of the mountain range, Darius. Even his name was spoken in reverent whispers. Some claimed he was more beast than man. Others insisted he commanded the very spirits of the mountain. No one dared to challenge him or even meet his penetrating gaze directly. He existed on the periphery of their community, neither fully part of it nor completely separate, like a wild animal that chose to tolerate their presence rather than accept their authority. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man had a right to be, with dark hair that caught the torchlight and seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. His face was carved from granite and shadow, all sharp angles and dangerous beauty that made her mouth go dry. But it was his eyes that stole her breath completely. Dark as a moonless night, they seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade to the vulnerable woman beneath. As he approached the platform, the silence in the hall became absolute. Not even the crackle of torch flames dared disturb the moment. Elder Miriam's face had gone pale as morning mist, and Evelyn could see the older woman's hands shaking where they gripped her ceremonial staff. "I claim her," Darius announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space despite being barely above a whisper. The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap, and Evelyn felt her knees threaten to buckle. "Evelyn belongs to me." The shock was palpable, a living thing that seemed to steal the oxygen from the air. Several women in the crowd gasped audibly, and Evelyn heard at least one man curse under his breath. This was unprecedented. Darius had never participated in community events, never shown interest in their traditions or customs. For him to suddenly appear and claim the woman no one else wanted was beyond unexpected. It was earth-shattering. Elder Miriam found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Darius, this is highly irregular. The auction follows specific protocols, and are you questioning my right?" His gaze shifted to the elder, and Evelyn watched the older woman visibly shrink under that dark stare. "I believe the tradition states that any man of the community may claim a woman during the ceremony. I am claiming Evelyn." Evelyn's heart was beating so hard, she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. This couldn't be happening. Men like Darius didn't rescue women like her from public humiliation. They certainly didn't claim them as companions in front of the entire community. Yet here he stood, solid and real and impossibly commanding, turning what had been the worst night of her life into something she couldn't even begin to understand. She wanted to speak, to ask him why, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her completely. Instead, she found herself studying his face, searching for some clue to his motivations. Was this pity? Some cruel joke that would become clear later? Or was there something else, something deeper in those midnight eyes that made her pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear? "The claiming stands," Elder Miriam announced reluctantly, though Evelyn could hear the displeasure in her voice. "Evelyn, you will go with Darius tonight." Tonight. The word hit her like ice water. She had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it in theory, but the reality was overwhelming. She would leave this hall as a claimed woman, bound to a man she had never spoken to, heading toward a future as mysterious and dangerous as the man himself. Darius extended his hand toward her, palm up in invitation rather than command. His skin was darkly tanned from mountain sun and marked with small scars that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. When she hesitantly placed her smaller hand in his, the contact sent shockwaves up her arm that seemed to settle somewhere deep in her chest. His touch was surprisingly gentle, despite the obvious strength in those long fingers. He helped her down from the platform with careful courtesy, as if she were made of spun glass instead of flesh and bone. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as they walked together toward the hall's massive wooden doors, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Just before they reached the exit, Evelyn caught sight of her mother's face in the crowd. The older woman's expression was a complicated mix of relief, fear, and something that might have been pride. At least her daughter hadn't gone completely unclaimed. At least there would be no shame of spinsterhood to bear. But Darius was an unknown quantity, and that uncertainty shadowed any relief her mother might have felt. The night air hit Evelyn's heated cheeks like a blessing as they stepped outside. Above them, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the moon. The sound seemed to resonate in Darius's chest, a barely audible rumble that she felt more than heard. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly, the first words he had spoken directly to her. Evelyn considered the question seriously. She should be terrified. Everything about this situation defied logic and safety. Yet when she looked up into his face, seeing it clearly for the first time without the dramatic shadows of the great hall, she felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in hours, perhaps years, she wasn't being judged or found lacking. She wasn't too stubborn, too curious, too different. She was simply chosen. "I should be," she answered honestly. "But I'm not. Not of you." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that granite composure that let her glimpse something vulnerable beneath. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but the memory of it warmed her more than any fire could have. They walked in comfortable silence along the winding mountain path that led away from the community center. The sounds of the celebration feast grew fainter behind them until only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant song of nightbirds remained. Evelyn's silk slippers, designed for dancing rather than hiking, were completely inadequate for the rocky terrain, but she bit her lip and continued without complaint. Darius must have noticed her struggle because he suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "The path is treacherous in those shoes," he observed, his gaze dropping to her feet. Before she could respond, he swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. The sudden intimacy of being held against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and breathing in his scent of pine and wood smoke, and something uniquely male, made her head spin. She had never been this close to a man before, had never felt the solid strength of masculine arms or the security of being completely protected. "Better?" he asked, and she caught the hint of amusement in his voice. "Much," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. As they continued up the mountainside, Evelyn found herself stealing glances at his profile. In the moonlight, he was devastatingly handsome, in a rough, untamed way that made her stomach flutter with unfamiliar sensations. This was so far beyond anything she had imagined for her life that she felt as if she were living in one of the fairy tales her grandmother had whispered to her as a child. But even fairy tales had dark elements, and as they climbed higher into the wild heart of the mountain, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that her real story was just beginning. Whatever had motivated Darius to claim her tonight, whatever secrets lay hidden in his past, whatever challenges awaited them in his remote mountain home, she sensed that nothing would ever be the same again. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with something dangerously close to anticipation. But what happened in the days to come would change everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, and about the true nature of the man who had saved her from a life of shame and solitude. The cabin emerged from the darkness like something from a dream, perched on the highest accessible peak of the mountain range, where the air was thin and sharp with the promise of snow. Evelyn had expected something primitive, perhaps even crude, but what she saw took her breath away. The structure was built from massive logs that seemed to grow naturally from the rocky ground, as if the mountain itself had shaped them into shelter. Warm, golden light spilled from multi-paned windows, and smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney that reached toward the star-scattered sky. Darius set her down gently at the threshold, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. The brief contact sent waves of heat through her body that had nothing to do with the nearby fire she could smell burning within. "Welcome home," he said quietly, and something in his voice made the simple words sound like a sacred promise. Home. Evelyn had never felt truly at home anywhere, not even in the house where she had grown up. There, she had always been too much of something or not enough of something else. Too curious, too stubborn, not compliant enough, not traditional enough. But standing here in the wilderness with this enigmatic man, surrounded by the vast silence of the mountain, she felt a strange sense of belonging settle into her bones. The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Rich wood paneling gleamed in the firelight, and hand-woven rugs in deep jewel tones covered the polished floors. Bookshelves lined one entire wall, filled with volumes that made her fingers itch to explore their contents. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the furniture, while simple, was beautifully crafted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of loving hands and endless patience. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Did you build all of this yourself?" "Most of it," Darius replied, moving to stoke the fire. The flames leaped higher at his touch, casting dancing shadows across his angular features. "I've had years to work on it, years to get it right." There was something in his tone that suggested those years had been lonely ones, and Evelyn felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this man who had rescued her from humiliation. She wandered toward the bookshelves, her curiosity overcoming her nervousness. The titles were an eclectic mix of philosophy, poetry, natural sciences, and works on herbalism and traditional medicine. It was the library of someone with a deep, inquiring mind, someone who sought knowledge for its own sake, rather than for practical application. "You're surprised," Darius observed, watching her examine his collection. "I am," she admitted honestly. "The stories about you, they make you sound like some kind of wild hermit. But this," she gestured around the warm, inviting space, "this is the home of an educated man. A thoughtful one." A bitter smile touched his lips. "People prefer their monsters simple and mindless. It's easier than acknowledging that the things they fear might be more complex than they're comfortable admitting." The word monsters hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that made Evelyn's pulse quicken. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression warned her that tonight was not the time for such questions. Instead, she pulled a slim volume of poetry from the shelf and opened it to a random page. She walks in beauty, like the night, she read aloud, then looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. Byron. I love his work. Most people consider his writing scandalous, Darius said, moving closer. Too passionate, too unconventional. Maybe that's why I like it, Evelyn replied with a small smile. I've never been very good at conventional. Something shifted in the atmosphere between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. They were both outcasts in their own ways, both too complex for the simple categories their community preferred. The realization created a fragile bridge of understanding that neither quite dared to cross yet. You must be exhausted, Darius said finally, his voice carefully neutral. There's a bedroom upstairs. It has its own fireplace and... He paused, and she caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his expression. You'll be safe there. I sleep downstairs. The consideration in his voice touched something deep in her chest. He was being careful with her, respectful of her fears and the strangeness of their situation. She had expected many things from this night, but such thoughtful courtesy hadn't been among them. The bedroom was as beautifully appointed as the rest of the cabin, with a massive four-poster bed covered in soft furs and wool blankets. A fire crackled merrily in the smaller fireplace, casting warm light over furniture that had been crafted with the same loving attention to detail as everything else. Fresh wildflowers sat in a simple clay vase on the windowsill, their sweet fragrance adding an unexpectedly feminine touch to the masculine space. The flowers are beautiful, she said softly. Darius paused in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame as if he needed the support. I wasn't sure. I wanted you to feel welcome. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Evelyn felt her heart squeeze with unexpected tenderness. This dangerous, mysterious man, who had appeared like a dark angel to save her from disgrace, had picked wildflowers for her arrival. The contradiction between his fearsome reputation and his gentle actions was dizzying. Thank you, she whispered. For everything, for claiming me tonight, for bringing me here, for... She struggled to find words for the overwhelming gratitude that filled her chest. For making me feel wanted. The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His knuckles went white where they gripped the doorframe, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Sleep well, Evelyn, he said roughly, then disappeared into the shadows of the hallway before she could respond. Alone in the beautiful room, Evelyn sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, she had been preparing for what she hoped would be the most important night of her life. Instead, it had become something far more complex and mysterious than she could have imagined. She changed into the simple nightgown she found laid out on the bed, another thoughtful touch that made her wonder just how long Darius had been planning to claim her. The garment was soft as a whisper against her skin, and she couldn't help but wonder where he had gotten it or how he had known her size. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with strange dreams of dark eyes and gentle hands, of wolves singing to the moon and ancient secrets whispered in a language she almost understood. She woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood and sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over a vista so breathtaking it made her gasp. The entire mountain range spread below them like a green and gold carpet, with the community's buildings visible as tiny specks in the distance. She was higher than she had ever been, closer to the sky than to the earth, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Darius was in the yard below, splitting logs with fluid, powerful strokes that spoke of years of practice. He had removed his shirt in the morning warmth, and Evelyn found herself mesmerized by the play of muscles across his back and shoulders. Scars marked his skin in patterns that told stories of violence and survival, but even those somehow added to, rather than detracted from his appeal. She dressed quickly in the simple dress she found hanging in the wardrobe, another mysterious addition that fit her perfectly. When she made her way downstairs, she found breakfast waiting on the rough-hewn table, fresh bread still warm from the oven, honey that tasted of wildflowers, and eggs from chickens she could hear clucking somewhere nearby. "Good morning," Darius said as he entered, his hair damp with sweat and his skin glistening in the morning light. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," she replied honestly. "This place is incredible." "How long have you lived here?" 5 years, he answered, moving to wash his hands at the basin by the window. "Since I left the community." Left or were driven away? The question slipped out before she could stop it, but she found she genuinely wanted to know. His hands stilled in the water, and for a moment the only sound was the distant cry of an eagle circling overhead. When he turned to face her, his expression was carefully controlled. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Evelyn considered the question seriously. She thought about his beautiful home, his obvious intelligence and education, the gentle way he had treated her despite his fearsome reputation. She thought about the flowers by her bedside and the careful respect he had shown for her comfort and safety. "I think," she said slowly, "that you chose to leave rather than become what they expected you to be." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise mixed with what might have been relief. "You're very perceptive. I've had practice reading between the lines," she replied. "Being different in a community like ours teaches you to pay attention to what people don't say as much as what they do." They ate in comfortable silence, but Evelyn's mind was spinning with questions. What had driven him to isolation? What had the community expected him to become that he found so unacceptable? And why, after 5 years of solitude, had he suddenly decided to claim her as his companion? After breakfast, Darius showed her around the property. There was a garden where herbs and vegetables grew in neat rows, a small barn that housed the chickens and a pair of goats, and a workshop where he created the beautiful furniture that filled the cabin. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency and careful planning, of a man who had built a life deliberately separate from the constraints of society. "It's like its own little world up here," Evelyn marveled as they stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the forest that stretched to the horizon. "That was the idea," Darius replied, "a place where I could be myself without judgment or expectation. And now you've brought me into it," she said softly. "Why?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because you looked the way I felt that night 5 years ago. Lost, rejected, certain that you would never be enough for anyone." He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes took her breath away. "I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy someone the way they tried to destroy me." The raw honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected many possible explanations for his actions, but such profound empathy hadn't been among them. This man, who appeared so strong and self-sufficient, understood her pain because he had lived it himself. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Darius looked away, his jaw clenching as if the memories were physically painful. "They wanted me to be something I wasn't. When I refused to conform, they made it clear that I was no longer welcome among them." It was a careful non-answer, but Evelyn sensed the deeper currents beneath his words. The community had rigid expectations for everyone, but especially for its men. They were supposed to be providers and protectors, certainly, but also compliant members who didn't question tradition or authority. A man like Darius, with his obvious intelligence and strength, would have been expected to become a leader among them. His refusal to accept that role would have been seen as betrayal. "Their loss," she said firmly, and was rewarded with a ghost of a smile. "Perhaps," he replied, "but the isolation has been—" He paused, searching for words. "Difficult." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mountain sun. This strong, mysterious man was admitting to loneliness, to need. The vulnerability in that admission was more seductive than any physical attraction could have been. They spent the morning working together in the garden, and Evelyn was surprised by how natural it felt to move in rhythm with him, anticipating his needs and responding to his quiet directions. Her hands, soft from a life of relative privilege, quickly became dirty and scratched, but she found she didn't mind. There was something deeply satisfying about working the earth, about creating something beautiful and useful with her own hands. "You're a natural at this," Darius observed as she carefully transplanted seedlings with gentle precision. "I've always loved growing things," she replied. "My mother thought it was beneath me, but I used to sneak out to help old Henrik with his vegetable garden. He taught me about soil and seasons and how to listen to what plants need." "Henrik was a wise man," Darius said. "He understood that the earth has its own intelligence." They worked in comfortable silence after that, but Evelyn found herself stealing glances at her mysterious companion. In the clear mountain light, she could see details that had been hidden in the dramatic shadows of the previous night. His dark hair was shot through with premature silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. But it was the small scars that fascinated her most, evidence of a hard life lived on the edge of wildness. When they broke for lunch, Evelyn made a decision that surprised even her. While Darius prepared their simple meal, she slipped away to explore the cabin more thoroughly. Her curiosity had always been her defining characteristic, and now it drove her to understand this man who had so dramatically altered the course of her life. She found it in a drawer of his desk, hidden beneath papers covered with careful notes about weather patterns and plant growth. A leather-bound journal with pages yellowed by age and use. Her conscience warred with her curiosity for only a moment before she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was different from Darius's careful script, feminine and flowing with the graceful loops of someone who had been educated in the old traditions. As she read, Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. "My beloved Helena sleeps beside me as I write this, her hair like spun gold in the candlelight. Tomorrow we will announce our engagement to the community, and I cannot imagine being happier than I am in this moment. She is everything I could have hoped for in a companion, gentle and kind and beautiful beyond words. I count myself the most fortunate of men to have won her heart." The entry was dated 6 years ago, and it was signed with Darius's name. Evelyn's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading entry after entry about a love so deep and pure, it made her chest ache with longing. Helena had been his world, his heart, his reason for existing. The entries detailed their courtship, their engagement, their plans for a future filled with children and laughter, and the simple joy of two souls perfectly matched. And then, abruptly, the entries changed. "Helena is gone. The fever took her in 3 days, and I could do nothing but watch her slip away despite all my efforts to save her. The healer says there was nothing anyone could have done, but I cannot escape the feeling that I failed her when she needed me most. The community offers their sympathy, but I see the speculation in their eyes. Some are already suggesting that I should begin looking for a new companion, as if Helena could be replaced like a broken tool. They don't understand that she was not just my companion, she was the other half of my soul. Without her, I am only a shadow of the man I was meant to be." The journal entries that followed painted a picture of a man drowning in grief, fighting against a community that expected him to recover and move on, according to their timeline rather than his own. They pressured him to marry again, to fulfill his role as a provider and father, to stop mourning and return to being the strong leader they expected him to be. But Darius had refused. Page after page detailed his growing isolation, his rejection of their expectations, and finally his decision to leave rather than be forced into a life that felt like a betrayal of Helena's memory. "I cannot be the man they want me to be," read the final entry. "Helena was my heart, and they buried her with her. I will make my own way in the world, away from their demands and expectations. Perhaps in solitude I can find some measure of peace. Evelyn closed the journal with trembling hands, her heart breaking for the man whose pain bled through every word. Now she understood why he had rescued her from the auction, why he had seen something in her humiliation that resonated with his own experience. They were both casualties of a community that valued conformity over compassion, tradition over individual need. Did you find what you were looking for? Evelyn spun around to find Darius standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been hurt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, shame flooding through her. "I shouldn't have. I was just curious," he finished for her. "It's one of the things about you that I recognized. The need to understand, even when understanding comes at a cost." He moved into the room and took the journal from her nerveless fingers, holding it against his chest as if it contained something precious and fragile. "Helena," Evelyn said softly, testing the name on her tongue. "Yes." His voice was rough with old pain. "She was everything." "I'm not trying to replace her," Evelyn said quickly, needing him to understand. "I would never presume to." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something new in his dark eyes. "That's why I chose you. You're not Helena, and you never could be. But you're something else, something I didn't expect to find again." "What?" she whispered. "Hope," he replied simply. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or gratitude. This man, this wounded, complex, beautiful man, was offering her something she had never dared dream of. The chance to be valued not for how well she fit society's expectations, but for exactly who she was. But even as the realization warmed her, a part of her wondered if she would ever be able to compete with the memory of a perfect love lost too soon, and whether the community that had rejected them both would be content to let them find happiness in their mountain sanctuary. The answer to that question would come sooner than either of them expected, bringing with it challenges that would test not only their growing bond, but their very survival. The first signs of trouble came with the autumn winds that swept down from the highest peaks, carrying with them the scent of change and the whispered promises of a harsh winter ahead. Evelyn had been living in the mountain sanctuary for 3 months, and what had begun as an arrangement born of mutual need had slowly transformed into something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. She woke that morning to find Darius standing at the window, his body tense with an alertness that immediately set her nerves on edge. In the months she had known him, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, and everything about his posture screamed danger. "What is it?" she asked softly, pulling her shawl around her shoulders as she joined him at the window. "Visitors," he replied grimly, nodding toward the narrow mountain path that wound its way up to their sanctuary. 3 of them, climbing steadily. "They'll be here within the hour." Evelyn's stomach dropped as she recognized the figures making their way up the treacherous trail. Elder Miriam led the group, her ceremonial staff catching the morning sunlight as she navigated the rocky terrain with surprising agility for a woman of her age. Behind her came 2 of the community's most respected men, both of whom had served as witnesses at countless ceremonies and traditions. "They're coming for me," Evelyn whispered, and the certainty of it hit her like ice water in her veins. "Let them come," Darius said, but she could hear the tension beneath his calm exterior. "You're under my protection now. They have no authority here." But even as he spoke the words, both of them knew that authority and power were not always the same thing. Elder Miriam wielded influence that went far beyond official position, and her displeasure could make life very difficult for anyone who crossed her path. They prepared for the confrontation in tense silence. Darius armed himself with the subtle confidence that came from being on his own territory, while Evelyn tried to summon the courage that had sustained her through months of community disapproval and family disappointment. But as the visitors drew closer, she felt her hard-won confidence beginning to crack. The knock, when it came, was sharp and authoritative. Darius opened the door with deliberate slowness, his large frame filling the doorway in a way that clearly communicated he had no intention of inviting their guests inside. "Elder Miriam," he said with cool politeness, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" The older woman's eyes were chips of flint as she regarded him with obvious distaste. Behind her, the two men shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to challenge their leader's authority. "You know exactly why we're here, Darius," Elder Miriam replied, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent commanding respect and obedience. "The girl belongs with her own people, not hidden away in this wilderness like some shameful secret." "Evelyn is exactly where she chooses to be," Darius replied evenly. But Evelyn could see the dangerous stillness that had come over him, the predatory alertness that reminded her uncomfortably of stories whispered about his true nature. "The girl is confused and vulnerable," Elder Miriam continued, her gaze shifting to find Evelyn standing behind Darius's protective bulk. "She's been isolated from proper guidance and influence, filled with ideas that go against everything our community stands for. It's time for her to come home and face the consequences of her choices." "What consequences?" Evelyn found her voice at last, stepping forward despite Darius's subtle attempt to keep her behind him. "What have I done except accept a valid claiming according to your own traditions?" Elder Miriam's expression hardened. "You've consorted with forces that no decent woman should acknowledge. You've abandoned your family and your responsibilities to chase after fantasies that will only lead to ruin." "I've found happiness," Evelyn replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've found a place where I'm valued for who I am rather than judged for who I'm not. Happiness built on deception and unnatural desires," Elder Miriam spat. "You think we don't know what he is? You think the stories about him are mere superstition?" The words hung in the air like a physical threat, and Evelyn felt something cold and terrible settle in her stomach. She had heard the whispered stories, of course, the hints and rumors about Darius's true nature that the community shared in hushed voices when they thought no one was listening. But she had dismissed them as the fearful imaginings of people who couldn't understand a man who chose to live outside their rigid boundaries. Now, seeing the absolute certainty in Elder Miriam's eyes, she began to wonder if there might be more truth to those whispers than she had wanted to believe. "What I am is none of your concern," Darius said quietly, but there was something in his voice that made the hair on Evelyn's arm stand on end. "Evelyn is here by choice, and she's under my protection. That should be enough." "Your protection?" Elder Miriam laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You mean your influence, your corruption. We know what you've done to her, what you've awakened in her that should have remained dormant." "What are you talking about?" Evelyn demanded, but even as she asked the question, she felt a strange tingling in her fingertips, a sensation she had been experiencing more and more frequently in recent weeks. "Show her," Elder Miriam commanded, turning to the men who had accompanied her. One of them stepped forward holding a small cage, and Evelyn's heart lurched as she saw the injured bird inside, its wing clearly broken and its small body trembling with pain. "Heal it," Elder Miriam said, her eyes fixed on Evelyn's face. "Show us what you've learned in your months of isolation. Prove that the bloodline hasn't been completely corrupted." "I don't understand," Evelyn whispered, but even as she spoke, she found herself reaching toward the cage with hands that seemed to move of their own accord. The moment her fingers touched the bars, the tingling sensation exploded through her entire body, and the bird's panicked chirping suddenly transformed into something that sounded almost like words. "Help me, heal me, make the pain stop." Evelyn jerked her hands back as if the cage had burned her heart hammering against her ribs. "I didn't. That's not possible." Your grandmother was the most powerful healer our community had ever known, Elder Miriam said, her voice carrying a mixture of reverence and disgust. Before she was corrupted by forbidden knowledge and banished for practices that violated everything we hold sacred, we thought the bloodline had been diluted, that the gifts had been lost. But living with him has awakened something that should have remained buried. The world seemed to tilt around Evelyn as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed began to fall into place. Her grandmother's mysterious disappearance when she was a child, the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room, her mother's constant nervousness whenever anyone mentioned the older woman's name. She wasn't dead. Evelyn breathed. You banished her. You drove her away because she could do things you didn't understand. We protected the community from dangerous influences. Elder Miriam corrected coldly. Just as we're trying to protect it now. That gift comes with a price, girl. It demands sacrifices that you cannot imagine, and it leads inevitably to corruption and madness. Your grandmother chose forbidden knowledge over the welfare of her own people. Or maybe she chose truth over ignorance, Darius said quietly. And something in his tone made everyone turn to look at him. Maybe she understood that gifts like that are meant to be used, not buried out of fear. You would say that, Elder Miriam replied, her voice dripping with contempt. You who abandoned your humanity for the promise of power. You who chose the wild over civilization, the beast over the man. Enough. The word came from Darius with such quiet authority that it seemed to echo off the mountain peaks themselves. As he spoke, Evelyn felt the air around them change, becoming charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her pulse race. You've said your piece. Now leave. We're not leaving without the girl, Elder Miriam declared, but for the first time since arriving, she sounded uncertain. She belongs with her own kind, not with a creature who has forgotten what it means to be human. That was when Evelyn felt it. The change that swept through Darius like wildfire racing through dry grass. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and the birds in the nearby trees fell silent, as if sensing the presence of a predator beyond their comprehension. When Darius spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in places deeper than hearing. I said, leave. The two men who had come with Elder Miriam took an instinctive step backward, their faces pale with a fear they couldn't quite name. But the elder herself stood her ground, though Evelyn could see the effort it cost her. Show her what you really are, Elder Miriam challenged. Let her see the beast she's been sharing a bed with. Let her understand what she's truly chosen. Don't, Evelyn said quickly, moving to place herself between Darius and their unwelcome visitors. She could feel the barely restrained power radiating from him like heat from a forge, and some deep instinct warned her that once it was unleashed, there would be no taking it back. Please, just don't. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the mountain peak balanced on the edge of violence. Then slowly, Evelyn felt the tension begin to ease as Darius pulled his dangerous energy back under control. Wise choice, Elder Miriam said, though her voice carried more relief than she probably intended. But this isn't over. The community will not tolerate this corruption indefinitely. One way or another, the girl will be brought home. Try it, Darius replied with deadly calm. Come back here with your threats and your demands, and see what happens to people who threaten what I protect. The visitors left without another word, but their departure felt more like a strategic retreat than a defeat. As soon as they were out of sight, Evelyn felt her legs give out, and she sank onto the porch steps with her head in her hands. It's true, isn't it? She whispered. The stories about you, about what you are. Darius was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. Yes, he said simply, some of them are true. Evelyn looked up at him. This man who had saved her from humiliation and given her a sanctuary where she could discover parts of herself she had never known existed. In the months they had lived together, she had seen his gentleness, his intelligence, his capacity for kindness and protection. But she had also sensed the wildness in him, the part that belonged more to the mountain and the forest than to any human community. "Show me," she said quietly. "Evelyn, show me," she repeated more firmly. "If we're going to face this together, I need to understand what we're really dealing with. I need to see all of you, not just the parts you think I can handle." Darius studied her face for a long moment, searching for signs of fear or rejection. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and stepped back to give himself room. The change, when it came, was both gradual and shocking. It started with his eyes, the dark brown deepening to something that reflected light, like polished obsidian. His features sharpened, becoming more angular and predatory, while his already impressive height seemed to increase by several inches. When he smiled, she caught the glint of teeth that were definitely not entirely human. But it was his hands that completed the transformation, fingers lengthening into claws that could easily tear through flesh and bone, yet were controlled with such precision that he could have picked up a flower petal without damaging it. "This is what I am," he said, his voice carrying those inhuman harmonics that seemed to resonate in her very bones. Part human, part something else. The spirits of the mountain claimed me years ago, and I stopped fighting the change after Helena died. It seemed easier to embrace the wildness than to try to fit into a world that no longer wanted me. Evelyn stared at him, trying to process what she was seeing. Everything about him should have terrified her, should have sent her running back down the mountain toward the safety of the familiar. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the fluid grace of his movements, the obvious power held under perfect control, the way he watched her with such careful attention to her every reaction. "Do you hurt people?" she asked quietly. "Not unless they threaten what I protect," he replied honestly. "The change gives me strength and speed beyond human limits, but it doesn't make me a mindless beast. I'm still me, just more. Yes, that was exactly what he was. More powerful, more complex, more dangerous, but also more protective, more devoted, more capable of the kind of absolute loyalty that most people could only dream of finding. "And my grandmother's gifts?" she asked, flexing her fingers experimentally. "What Elder Miriam said about healing. Your bloodline carries the ability to connect with living things in ways that most people can't," Darius explained, his form gradually shifting back to human appearance. "To understand their needs, to channel energy that can heal or harm, depending on your intentions. It's not magic exactly, but it's not entirely natural either." Evelyn thought about the moments over the past few months when she had seemed to know exactly what injured animals needed, when plants had flourished under her touch in ways that seemed to go beyond normal gardening skills. She had attributed it to intuition and luck, but now she wondered if there had been something more at work. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Are you sure you want to learn?" Darius replied. "The path your grandmother chose led to exile and loneliness. Using gifts like that comes with a cost, and not everyone is willing to pay it." Evelyn thought about Elder Miriam's threats, about the community that had rejected her, and the family that had been willing to see her humiliated rather than stand up for her differences. Then she thought about the life she had found here in the mountains, the sense of belonging and purpose that had grown stronger with each passing day. "I'm already paying the cost," she said firmly. "The question is whether I'm going to let fear keep me from becoming who I'm meant to be." That night they began her real education. Darius taught her to feel the energy that flowed through all living things, to sense the patterns of health and sickness, strength and vulnerability. Under his patient guidance, she learned to channel that energy through her hands, to encourage healing and growth, with a touch that carried more than just physical warmth. The injured bird became their first success, its broken wing mending under her careful ministrations until it could fly free once more, But even as Evelyn marveled at what she had accomplished, she understood that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The community would not tolerate their growing power, and Elder Miriam would not be satisfied with threats and intimidation. Soon, they would face a confrontation that would test not only their abilities, but their commitment to each other and the life they were building together. But as winter closed its grip on the mountain and they prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, Evelyn found herself looking forward to that confrontation rather than dreading it. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She had found not only love, but purpose, not only acceptance, but power, and she was ready to fight for all of it. The real test would come with the spring thaw, when the community would make their final move to reclaim what they saw as their property and eliminate what they viewed as a growing threat to their way of life. But until then, Evelyn would continue to learn, to grow, and to discover just how much strength lay hidden in the heart of a woman who had finally found where she belonged. The mountain sang with ancient power, and for the first time in years, two souls who had been broken by the world had found the courage to make themselves whole.